thank you all for being here today. And I'd like to start with having each of you give us some of the background and some examples of where water management has been well integrated across governance scales, organizational units, and how trust was established across those teams to move projects forward. So, starting with Jen, and moving that way.
So, good afternoon, everybody. As Arella said, I'm Jen Grigliano. I'm the Chief of Staff for New York City's Bureau of Water Supply. You know, my job is to make sure that the water gets to New York and we meet the demand, that we are supporting public health and the quality of life of New York City. And that does come with a lot of challenges, as you can imagine, and managing the water supply from New York City is kind of unique. So part of our water supply system dams the Delaware River, the headwaters of the Delaware River. So that means that water that is sent down the river that is provided for several different uses, water supply, recreation, ecology, you name it, is actually provided by New York City. And we were actually under a Supreme Court decree. We are one of two river systems that are actually under a federal river master. So the federal river master helps us determine, you know, what the releases should be. We should be meeting our flow targets to ensure that, you know, enough water gets downstream so that we can support all of these issues. Changes to flow management in the river is actually done by a large working group, and it requires unanimous consent amongst these parties to the decree. So that's New York City, State of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the State of Delaware. And we manage these issues by coming together and forming a technical working group. And you know, this has been a very tough one for New York City to overcome. So the decree allows New York City to take up to 800 million gallons a day out of the Delaware River-basin to be used for our water supply. And to be a better partner and in the area, you know, we've worked with our working group members, but we've also gone out and we've met with the stakeholders. We've learned what the issues are and how we can maybe change our operations and institutional thinking, you know, to get around some of these issues and meet better needs of all. So what we've done is, in 2007, we adopted a new model. It's called the Operations Support Tool. And what this does is it helps us calculate what we call the forecast available water. So it shows us better forecasting, you know, what's coming into the system, what I need to use to meet demand, you know, what else is available to be released. So using this forecast-informed reservoir operation strategy, we make higher releases down the Delaware River than we have under any other flow management program that it has existed in the past. I mean, we're talking upwards of like more than a 1,200 CFS release difference. And that's huge, you know, for the ecology, for our other partners, for the other water supply users. And we wouldn't have been able to do that unless we changed the way that we think, unless our leadership was able to make this transition and change the way that we approach the situation and using, you know, this advancement in technology to be able to do so. But the problem that we're seeing now is that, you know, a lot of the stakeholder groups got what they wanted. So now they're starting to disengage from the process a little bit. And that is extremely unhelpful as we are now experiencing, you know, the effects of climate change. You wouldn't think necessarily that sea level rise would be an issue that plagues New York City's water supply that's up in the mountains, but it does. So New York City's Delaware releases are based on the position of the salt front in the lower Delaware during drought emergency. So that means the water that comes from me taking 6 days to get down to the lower basin to fight the salt front, it's not actually getting there. It's being lost during this times of drought. It's going into groundwater recharge. It's being evaporated. It's not really getting there. So now this is my conundrum and my challenge. How do I bring these people back to the table? How do I get their trust back to have them help me solve this issue? Because if New York City can't meet demand, if we don't have the storage, then the storage isn't there to release for ecology. It's not there to support thermal releases during the summer to help the fisheries. It's not there to help push back the salt front so that Philadelphia's water is protected from sea level rise. So what are we doing to get around this? So one of the biggest things that we are working on right now is actually engaging with the Corps of Engineers to have them change the way that they're operating. So the Corps operates a series of reservoirs in Pennsylvania. Most of them are for flood control. One reservoir in particular is Francis E. Walter Reservoir. That one is used for recreation and flood control. But we're asking them to add water supply to those uses. And that has been very difficult to overcome, so we are engaged right now in a reevaluation study with them. This is a concept that has existed for 40 years. The Corps of Engineers already does this for us during times of drought, and it looks like we are going to be asking them to do this for the 14th time in 40 years, as we are really hovering that drought watch line right now. So they will store water higher in the reservoir for us to be able to call on, specifically the Delaware River-basin Commission, to be used for low flow augmentation during times of drought. Trying to get the stakeholder groups to understand how we are asking the Corps to change their operations has been very difficult. They think New York City is going to be building a pipeline from F.E. Walter to Staten Island to take it for water supply, which is not the case. They think that we're going to be managing the reservoir itself, which is not the case. You know, the recreation groups, there's a big kayaking contingent on the Lehigh Valley. They think that we are just coming in to change the world, and that's not the case. What we're asking the Corps to do is to adopt this forecast-informed reservoir operation strategy to be able to add more water into the river during times of drought. So the Corps is on board with helping us out, you know, going through this study and figuring out how to make it happen. We are engaging as part of that with the stakeholder groups, individually and in larger groups, to build the trust and to get out and meet with people. COVID has not helped that in any way, shape, or form. You definitely get much more out of the conversations when you're sitting face to face with someone other than on Zoom. So that's where we're working right now, and that's my biggest example to bring to the table today is getting everybody to actually come to the table, to take a look at the bigger picture, and to actually implement a strategy that works best, you know, for the majority, and to get out of the thinking that I just need what I need for me, and to think of it, you know, really as this one water concept. So I'm looking forward to the breakout session, you know, to sitting down with all of you and to figure out, you know, what are the root causes of that really, and how do we get around it. So thank you.
Wow, thank you, Jennifer. Chief of Staff for New York City's water needs, that's no small job. So Jennifer just brought an example of what she's dealing with up there and how the Corps is involved. I'm going to bring the focus down to an actual study, so something similar to what Jennifer's talking about, but here in Florida, it's called LOSUM. It's a Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual. It's basically the operational plan for Lake Okeechobee. So it's similar in that this is a study that's underway. It's been underway for almost 3 years now, and we're towards the closing stages. We're at a draft report stage right now that's out on the street for the public to see and comment upon. So this morning, Dr. Joe Manis, one of my colleagues at the Corps, talked about the shared vision planning that the Corps utilizes. So I'm going to talk about exactly that in this LOSUM study. So for those that don't know about Lake Okeechobee, it's the largest lake east of the Mississippi. It's quite a large water body. 71 square miles. So just think about the size there, just to get a picture. People call it the heart of the Everglades, and that's truly what it is, right? If you look at any map of Florida, that's the first thing your eyes go to. And for folks that are interested in historical fiction or love reading, avid readers, there's a really great book called A Land Remembered by Patrick Smith, one of my favorite all-time books, and it talks a lot about Lake Okeechobee and how it is the heart of the Everglades, the heart of Florida, and how it's changed by us humans through the course of the years. So I'll talk about how we got to where we are, this draft report stage, and how the public was involved and how we built some trust through the process. So how we started, Jennifer's example was she wanted the project purposes up north to be, thank you, to include water supply. In Lake Okeechobee's case, water supply is already project purpose. And in fact, fortunately, Congress had all the purposes it could think of when it authorized the works at Lake Okeechobee. So Congress basically brought in everything from water supply for agricultural purposes, municipalities, drinking water obviously, but also ecological needs, recreation needs, brought in every single purpose that it could think of. And that was great because it touched all the stakeholders. It touches everybody, to include the tribal interests in the area. So that's what we started with, and so just as a recommendation, as you're starting one of these efforts, if you have the opportunity to develop objectives, make them as holistic as possible to touch every single stakeholder that you can touch, and that way that helps you bring folks into the process, right? So in our case, we have a large project delivery team that includes every federal and state and municipality stakeholder. They're on the team. It's quite a large team. But in addition, we have non-governmental organizations, members of the public, and our 2 sovereign tribes that participate as well. Now, they're not on the PET, but they are invited to every single meeting. And then we have periods of time during the meetings when we ask for comment. And we take that comment, we incorporate that comment into the meetings. So that helps us because we're inviting every single entity to the table based on those objectives that I talked about earlier. And we're transparent, and we're inviting participation. That way we're building trust. But we went a little bit further. So every single entity that we did bring to the table has a different interest, right? Everybody's got their own goals, their own objectives. And so what we asked every single entity at the table and NGOs, tribes, members of the public, tell us how you would operate the lake. If it was your lake, if this was your project, how would you do it? We invited all of those ideas, and then what we committed to do was to analyze each and every one. And then Dr. Mann has talked about how you really have to commit some resources to some of these large water scale projects. This is one of those cases. We have 360,000 model runs, 360,000, because we analyzed every single idea that was brought to us. And what we did is we balanced the results against each one of those original project purposes. And so, hey, who in the room loves spreadsheets and loves looking at spreadsheets? Anybody? Anybody? There's a few out there, right? But not everybody. Dr. Mann has talked about you got to keep models simple, but we couldn't do that with this large lake and this large system that we were looking at. So what we also did to help build trust with the community is we taught them how to read the outputs from the model. So after the meetings, after the general meetings, we talked about what we were doing for that particular day. We said, hey, listen, if you want to understand how the outputs of the model work, if you want to learn how to use them, we're going to take the next hour after this meeting and we're going to tell everybody what these results mean, how to read the charts, so that folks are not hearing about the interpretation of the model from somebody. They're actually able to interpret the results themselves, right? So that was huge, huge for us, because that really got people engaged. And so, so we have their ideas, we incorporated their ideas, brought inclusion and therefore respect for each entity into the process. And so, in summary, we did incorporate the planning vision strategy, the shared vision planning approach that we have at the Corps of Engineers by developing objectives that were all-inclusive. Congress helped us do that, but anybody can do that. And then bringing people into the process, and then asking them for their ideas, and then actually analyzing each and every one so that they could see how their ideas affected others. That's why. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And it's kind of ironic that Eric is sitting to my right. We'll talk a little bit about him later as we try to address some of our challenges in Key Biscayne. I'm going to try something different, and if the guys in the back can put some slides up, I'd appreciate it. I was actually going to try to be like Hardeep, but I didn't wear my white suit, so I'm going to take it easy here. See if they can pop it up. Anyway, I'm Steve Williamson, the manager of Village of Key Biscayne. And appreciate the opportunity from Hardeep and Yadala to be here today. We are like no other member up here. We're a small municipality, but we are facing some significant water issues. But we're the downstream of all those problems, no pun intended, where everything you all from the higher level are working, tends to come in our direction. But we're in the trenches, we're working this hard in the front lines. And what I'm going to do over the next couple of minutes is just go through these 2 slides here, kind of give you an idea of what we're trying to achieve at Key Biscayne, and then use the breakout session to talk about some of the solutions. So now I know why Hardeep was able to do that so well. I got a slide right in front of you, I can see. So I was actually pretty impressed, but not so much now. So now Hardeep was pretty impressed. I should take that. He's a great man. So what are the challenges that a coastal village like Key Biscayne face when we deal with water? I mean, you can see up on the slides, it's pretty straightforward, but behind a couple of these words, it's pretty significant. We've talked about sea level rise. I think I've heard that about 20 to 30 times today. The increased severity and intensity of storms, and what that means for us on Key Biscayne, a village that is completely surrounded by water, that thinks about and makes decisions just about every day about water, is that we have to think about storm surge. We have to think about rain. We have to think about how that's going to impact mobility as well as our quality of life, and also how our protection of our population. We have a very, very high water table. So you start to add all 3 of those together, you can just imagine water coming from the bottom, water coming from the side, and water coming from the top. And then of course, we deal with potential water contamination. We're right down the, not saying that this happens to the water and sewer plant, but we are just downstream from the water sewer plant. When water raises, we have some of those issues, and we've faced that over the last couple of years. So from an internals perspective, what are some of the vulnerabilities we face? Infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. I could go into the history of Key Biscayne, but let's just say nobody planned back in 1950s when they asked all the veterans to come down and get a slice of heaven about sea level rise and storm surge. So it's a flat island with flat roads and no storm systems whatsoever. So we are dealing with that. It's inadequate, it's old, and as you know, it's very costly. We are low elevations, pretty much 1 elevation, that's about it. I think we might be at 6 NABD at one place. We'll find out when we keep the study going. Our shorelines are not very protected. That's why I've got this guy next to me here. I'm working him hard to get the Corps of Engineers to do our project. And then we also have shared boundaries. To our north is Crandon Park, Miami-Dade County Park. So we have a separate jurisdiction to our north. And to our south, we have Bill Baggs State Park, yet another jurisdiction. So we have a village, we have the county, and the state trying to come together with a single solution. And we could probably spend an entire day, maybe even 2 days, talking about the restrictive and outdated regulations and policies that we have when it comes to water policy. So the risks are very self-evident. I don't really need to talk about those in details, but the one I do want to address is the second to the last one, and that really becomes the inability to fully execute the solutions. It's very easy for people to throw their hands up in the air and say, this is too expensive, this is too inconvenient, this is hard. And we're facing that right now. And we have to convince our population that this investment is important. This really is where your future is. And so you've got to balance that, not to scare them by overwhelming them on what has to happen, but at the same time making sure they know it's important, that they have to make that investment. If you go to the next slide, please. So, a lot going on this slide, but this encapsulates what we are trying to achieve at the village of Key Biscayne. If you look at the left, that's all the work that we've done, our institutional knowledge, the studies, the assessments, all the other research we've done, and I've got with me back in the back left, somewhere back there, Roland Samimi, who's done a lot of this work. Raise your hand, Roland. Thank you. And our partners. We have partners all the way across the county, the state, the federal government. Eric's sitting here to my left. And right now we're putting together a program strategy. How do we tackle these problems that we face? And I've kind of outlined it into 5 lines of effort. The shoreline protection. What are we going to do with storm surge? What are we going to do with sea level rise? Stormwater systems. Of course, that's stormwater, but it's also water quality. what do we do to make sure as we put our stormwater systems in place that we're thinking about water quality, particularly all of our outfalls go into the Biscayne Aquatic Preserve too. So I don't want to mess with Urella there because she'll be on me on that one. So roadway improvements. We're looking at roadways as not a way just for transportation, but how do you integrate them into a stormwater system? How do you take advantage of the swales? How do you build them properly so that they become part of the system? And then utilities protection and also resilience. We're undergrounding utilities or looking to underground utilities, but we're also working with the water and sewer department on how do we improve obviously the water systems, making sure we have quality water, and they also have good sewer systems that can take that sewage away. So as you begin to see, we've now talked about 6 or 7 different types of water conveyances that we are trying to deal with as we go across Key Biscayne and moving forward. But what I really want to just highlight, and then I think we can discuss in the breakout session, are the 4 areas that we, and I think it's also true for other small municipalities, face. And those are those perpendicular lines that go across those arrows, is expertise. I mentioned Rowan in the back, but I've got 1 chief resilience officer and 1 director of public works. That's about how deep I am. So, I've got to make sure that I partner and get support from other organizations. Staff capacity, not just from an expertise level, but procurement, finance, budgeting, those sort of things that if you don't have those people in place, you can't make a program work. Funding goes without saying. Although luckily we are a well-off village, we need more money than we have right now, and we have to make sure that we figure out where does that come from the federal government, from the state government, from the county government, maybe even there might be some private options as well. And then lastly, and I mentioned it before, but I think I'm going to say it again because I think it's so important, because I've heard it over and over again today, is policies and regulations. How do we get out from that intertwined rope that policies have restricted us and regulations have restricted us, to help us permit projects, to how do we address things like installing seawalls, installing living shorelines, addressing seagrasses in the nearby to our shore. All those things come down to the tactical level construction and work that we're trying to do at Key Biscayne. So there's a lot more to talk about. I'd like to take that when we get into the breakout session. But I'm going to make one more pitch. Eric, I'm sitting here. I need some help on the shoreline. Any help recording it? I appreciate it. So anyway, thank you very much.
I think, running up about 3 or 4 down here. Thanks, Steve. And it is great to be here. Kevin Carter, I'm with Broward County's Water and Wastewater Services, just up the road. It can be about a 40-minute drive or a 2-hour drive, depending on what time you decide to take it. I'm kind of playing the middle size utility here on this panel, and I'm going to be talking about the South Florida watershed. But before I do, there's been a lot of thank yous, but I want to thank all the visitors that are out there in the crowd. Thank you for coming to Florida. As the local person, I feel like I have home court advantage, and I'm learning so much from this national and international crowd. So please give yourselves a round of applause. Listen, we're on South Beach getting paid to talk about water. Who has it better? And Palm Beach County, a little further up the road at 1.5. So we got about 6 million people stuffed in this tough, tight urban area, surrounded by one of the greatest ecological treasures to the west that was drained so we could all be here. A thriving agribusiness that runs the economy of Central Florida, and the incredible coral reef, incredible bay, and marine sources just to the east. A lot of competing needs for water. And so the thing that I want to reference when we think about watersheds and watershed plans that we can learn from is the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan. We got to go back now 25 years to the 90s when people realized, I'm going to use this word too, out of necessity, there needed to be some trust built through the processes that Eric did. We weren't going to go forward in a sustainable fashion unless we all got in the room, got together. It wouldn't be the perfect plan. It couldn't be the perfect plan for one stakeholder when you have as many as we do. But that was one of the key moments in South Florida's watershed. Is 2020, or that was 2000. We're 22 years into it. I think one of our speakers, I think it was David from USGS on the last panel, talked about adaptation. Certainly have been a critical part of that. Also now, in this year's Water Resource Development Act, we're going to restudy the system. 20 years ago, people thought about sea level rise, but now we're living it. And so what's the system going to be like looking forward? Next time you guys are in town, hopefully we'll have more insights into that. So building off of that, there's actually been some utilities that have also done things similar to SERP, as we call it. And one of the key features of that is storage. And basically thinking of one water, thinking of storm water from a drinking water utility perspective. And so we have a private-public partnership called the C51 Reservoir, storing water that currently goes to tide, harms the estuary up in Palm Beach County, and it's going to come as far south as Miami-Dade County. So we're very excited about that. That shows regional partnerships, it shows one water, and it shows utilities, not just thinking that we can just draw from our major groundwater source and sustain our resources and populations.
Thank you. So, hi, I'm Meghna. So I'm the lone academic on this panel here. So what I'm going to try and do is try to synthesize some of the discussion case studies we've heard so far. And one of the things I think when it comes to urban communities or rural communities or even tribal nations is that everybody is at some level struggling with trying to resolve uncertainty about whether it's like the amount of water or quality of water available or the quality year to year, how it changes in terms of stocks and flows. That's one uncertainty everybody's struggling with. As you can see, the theme up here is sort of emerging since the morning, right? And also the other one is how do we resolve the ripple effects of our decisions, right? And there's a legacy system, there's history that informs us. That's where everybody is currently kind of stuck in. So if you think about one water governance, and as we move forward, you can clearly see that in order to be better at trying to resolve some of these uncertainties and the ripple effects, we need to think about where are we actually stalling. So yes, of course, engaging stakeholders, but it's also important to realize that we can't govern something that we can't measure, right? And all of us in this room agree with that. You cannot govern what you cannot measure. So how do we get better at that? And why do we need to get better at that? So what I'm going to do is so in the earlier panel, Steve talked about the water energy nexus. I'm going to try and give an example from the food energy water nexus perspective here. And so if you think about like why measurement is important to try and get towards the one water governance, if you think about like your, say the sustainable goal number 2, which is about food security, right? So imagine we're trying to, reach food security as one of our goals as communities, and then, you essentially have, as population increases, you basically are going to have overconsumption of water. If you can't track how reaching food security goals is going to affect the water consumption, if you can't measure and track it, then you will be actually not able to reach your other sustainable goal number 6, which is on water security, right? So there's an interconnection of these decisions that we need to be able to understand, and only through tracking and measuring and doing systematic analysis, which in the morning Ken also talked about the USGS presentation about water counting. So that sort of starts ringing bell, right? That's really important for us. Another example I want to give is, again, from the agriculture perspective, but this is now like looking at energy and water. So imagine you suppose one day we reach the, say, sustainable goal number 7, we're doing great, it's on energy, and we have, say, we're using a lot of solar energy everywhere. And now what happens is, because of really cheap supply of energy, folks start over-consuming water, right? So if you're not tracking that, how the overconsumption starts happening, because now energy is available, then you're now again going back and violating your other sustainable development goals. So these sustainable development goals also can have trade-offs among them, and you can't really understand what they look like until you don't measure. And one water governance has to think about that perspective, as you can see from all these case studies. So while Ken in the morning talked about water counting, as a national initiative, I would say that communities, local, whether it's rural communities, whether it's urban, tribal nations, all of us have to think about water quality at different scales, right? And the essence of water, so you can think about water accounting as financial accounting, right? But it's more than that. It's not just about trying to do a balance sheet of the water cycle. It can really provide as a really meaningful and foundational framework for systematically trying to integrate data, whether it's data which is raw data you're collecting or derived data which comes from really fancy data analytics tools. So now you can integrate data and coordinate governance of water among the different currently siloed agencies. So even though we have different governmental agencies, they don't necessarily have to function in a siloed manner once you have that common thread of water accounting framework. You can also think about, in terms of governance, how a water accounting framework can actually support an inclusive process, right? By bringing different kinds of diverse stakeholders, like we talked about here in this panel also, ranging all the way from politicians to your water managers to public, in a way that you can sort of start using a common water accounting language. So there's a common language that you can use to communicate to public and to politicians and managers, and then develop some sort of a shared awareness of your system, whether it's shared awareness of what's happening with the natural resources, shared awareness when it comes to our assets, like our infrastructure assets, or even the stakeholder conditions when it comes to other goals in terms of water demand and access. The other thing you can think about how water accounting framework would help with governance is something like actually improve transparency in decision making, right? And sort of make it easier to inform regulation, economic, or even political debates. And then another fourth thing that I want to talk about is how you could use it to monitor not just water supply and use it regularly, but also help inform how we measure performance, right? Measure performance with respect to, say, productivity, efficiency, or even equity, which could be one of the goals of One Water governance. And finally, I just want to pinpoint that auditing of these water accounts can be really helpful if you do them at a river-basin scale, because it can help us also understand some of these unnoticed hydrological costs of some of the development we do, and also communicate some of the true value of our water, as well as try to justify many of the financial investments, which everybody is struggling with in terms of, now that we have new funding available, how do we justify investments, right? So is it a way you can use this common language to show the benefits? So I do want to point out, I won't go too much into detail, but like in 2020, as part of the NSF ERC panel planning grant that Sunil led, we actually wrote a white paper. Edgar was involved, many other folks in this room were also involved in that effort. And we kind of sort of, identified some potential paths forward where water accounting at different scales could be useful for One Water governance. And I'll just sort of give you some two ideas here, but really I'm hoping that in the breakout session is where you all also contribute to us ideas of how we move forward. One of them was to sort of define and establish a national One Water policy directive so that we can urge water accounting at different scales across the country and start to operationalize how we govern water across different agencies. And also try and identify use cases and studies and case studies where you could have pilot projects where water accounting could be helpful to understand how to overcome some of the legacy problems we may have or legacy systems we may have. How do we move forward? And that'll have to be place-based, right? Because the problems you see in South Florida may not be the problems you see in the West, for example, or up in the Northeast. So as regions change, there will be place-based solutions, and those projects could really help inform a nationwide effort, and also other communities how to use it as a model. So those are my thoughts. I wanted to sort of summarize as an academic on the table. But I really encourage you all in the breakout session to sort of think about how do you think we should operationalize One Water governance as based on experiences you've had, and as well as what pathways do you see for our country moving forward? And when I mean by country, it's everybody, and the tribes, the rural communities, the urban communities, the coastal communities, everybody, all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. What an expert panel. But we're not done. We still have some time, right, Sunil? We have some time. Great. So amazing. Water accounting. I like that concept. But it sounds very mathematical.
Talk to the engineer.
Typical academic, right? But really, I think what just to summarize everything, and I usually take technical stuff and I translate it so that the general public can understand it. I know you all are academics and engineers and science folks, but my job is to communicate and really persuade and teach to get that trust built and those projects ultimately supported and built. So what I'm hearing here is something that I think we all in the breakout session, and I hope many of you can join us to start building this path forward for everyone really, is how do we operationalize one water strategy where, and it's not, obviously it's not cookie cutter, but how do we, package the solutions and the successes that have worked and kind of put it all in a bottle so we can sell it. And so that's something that, and I don't know if you all have more to share, but just from my experience and serving on the task force for Biscayne Bay and developing all those recommendations from multiple stakeholders, and even members of our task force were made up of professionals, private professionals, and even public professionals from the county. And we really, really relied a lot on science and engineering, but also something that Steve said that we're starting to work on right now is updating policies. And I'm sure this is not, only here. We have policies that date back to the 1970s. I mean, seriously. We're updating our codes, and I see some of our folks here from our regulatory department. We're updating our codes to incorporate sea level rise and climate impacts. None of that, even with Everglades, 20 years ago, we weren't even thinking about sea level rise. And so updating all those models and in that context of the uncertainty that we face, because we really don't know how much, by when. Obviously it's all accelerating. We're all seeing that now, but in the breakout session, I really want to dig deep and see, take the examples of success and try to figure out how do we operationalize it, where it doesn't matter where you are in this country or even globally. How can we build that model so that the balance is there? Something that I love, the Corps, Corps comes up with really cool marketing things now and then. And it's, for Everglades, it's about, when it comes to water, it's quantity, quality, and timing. And it's water management 101, but it's so complex at the same time. And we're seeing the effects now. So I don't know if you all want to add anything, but you're open to. And we can also take some questions from the audience, right, Sunil?
Yes.
Okay. Anything to add? I know, Kevin, you're dying.
Yeah, what? Yep, let me get my mic. So, here we go. You can hear me? Yeah. Okay. I want to, they have one of our questions is up on the screen. And one of the ones at the end there is, what is the value proposition of Smart One Water and how will it be maintained? And I want to go back to some of our earlier speakers. Maria Lehman brought it up. There was a couple others who talked about workforce development as a challenge. I actually think this could be an opportunity too. My son's 23. Think of the next generation of people in the water sector. He tells me he's hungry with text, even if he's in the room next door. They turn on lights by talking to somebody named Sarah, and so it's a challenge, yes, because we're having trouble keeping people. Our IT folks can go work at home or some Caribbean island, do the same thing, and get paid twice as much. So I'm not playing down the challenge, but anytime you look at a challenge, just think of that opportunity. And one of the things we're doing in Broward, our school system, is we're putting curriculums in the high school to get to the folks earlier. And I think we may even need to go earlier to sell our industry and to make it that they will be sustaining. And they're not just going to accept using technology, they're going to demand it. That's what they're used to. So let's take that challenge and let's turn it into an opportunity in our breakout session.
Anybody else?
I got one more. Funding. We've heard about it. State has it. The federal government has it. I'll turn over to you real quick, Eric, but I just want to put this in people's heads. Now is the time to build that addition to your house, right? Now is the time that you can look at this funding and not because you are just building onto your house, but because you need it for future growth. You need this technology. I think it was Ms. Powell from DC Water, not just to buy bells and whistles, but to buy smart solutions for your customers. And so that's something else I want to plant in your head, how we do that, how we take this generational funding and really push forward the SOW.
Kevin stole what I was going to say because really 100% right. The innovation is very, very costly. And we all know that, right? But what we found is when we innovate, we're able to come up with a solution, albeit extremely costly, but then through continued iterations of that solution, we bring the cost down. We get smarter in figuring it out, and we're able to bring the cost down. So we definitely have to partner in order to achieve that funding to meet that initial need, and it's really, really costly. But I try to go into it with a thought process of, yes, it's going to be extremely expensive, but we're smart enough to be able to bring the cost down. At the beginning, really high, but we can get it down cheaper. So don't be afraid of innovation. Just a Kevin's.
So I'd like to introduce Jen Farwald, who works with me at New York City. So Jen works in our division of innovation and research. So one of the things that we've established at New York City DEP is this new division who actually is responsible for working with the Bureau of Water Supply to go out and look at other utilities. Look and see what's going on, whether it's private sector, public sector, federal, local, it doesn't matter. What's working, what's not working, how do we communicate together, how do we work together, how do we find the best of what's going on, and how do we implement it at the water supply. We also do a lot of internal research on our own, and they help us fill those gaps and they help us promote it. So having a section that goes out and looks at all these different things, asks us where our gaps are, what our problems are, and helps us find solutions has been incredibly invaluable to the Bureau to be able to go out and do something like that.
If I could just build on what Jennifer just said, was listen to your stakeholders in your communities, right? Because they can provide you what the value proposition would be for you. So in every place you go, region you go, Smart One Water may have different value to the community, it's different benefits. What is it that your community really could benefit from in a framework like this, right? So I think there's no one solution fits all, I guess.
Great. Well, I'm going to put my chamber hat. For those locals, I still chair the Resilience Committee at the Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce. And I always say that here in South Florida, the environment is the economy. And so whatever we do to invest in that environment will pay back. But challenges create opportunities, and they create private-public partnerships. And something that you all in the private sector, many of you who are sponsoring this very event know very well how important that synergy between our relationship with government and the private sector, between academia, the private sector, and governance, I think we can certainly create a Smart One Water model and maybe incubate it right here in Miami-Dade County. With that, do we have time for a couple questions from the audience?
Yes.
All right. I'm going to stand up so you can see me over there.
One in the back there.
Jennifer, you spoke about how you had a functional collaborative group for a while, but then it fell apart. Can you talk a little bit about the elements that allowed that or encouraged that collaborative group to come together and what you're doing to try and reestablish that motivation?
Right, so the group came together really by force, thanks to the Supreme Court. So we had this conundrum that, we are managing a basin-wide river system. And actually what brought us together to actually work together was the new drought of record in the Delaware River Basin, and that happened in the 1960s. And we realized that the provisions in the decree that the Supreme Court set didn't get us through that drought of record. We had to come back to the table and we had to negotiate, a different flow regime and how it would work so that the 4 basin states could make it. We all had to make it together. It was one river system, we had to work together. So, this group comes together in bits and spurts. There's a problem, we come together, we solve it, then it kind of goes back into its silos. And we've been trying to break away from that and keep everybody engaged and keep everybody at the table, which has been difficult. But to get people out of their mindset of mine, I need, and come together for the big collective and to see the whole picture just is beyond difficult to do. So that's the problem that we're facing right now, is that you don't necessarily have people at the table with the same skill sets and abilities to be able to do the science and then politically negotiate it, to be able to pull together a program that meets the needs of many. So by engaging the different stakeholder groups from the different locations and the different municipalities of different competing interests and trying to get them to understand has been a massive undertaking. And I have spent a lot of time in the car driving down to Philadelphia or the state of Delaware to try to get them to understand not only my point of view, but to take the time to understand their point of view, to be able to bring it together and then try to be that link that can see the whole picture, to work with my peers to be able to do it that way. And we've gotten a couple of others on board by doing it that way, but it's very difficult to politically negotiate science.
I had a question, sorry. I guess in regards to, you sort of alluded to it, but, data sharing, the framework for that recently, because, you two had mentioned about, Pennsylvania, the dams, and the Corps all working together. I think knowing the operations of what's, sorry. Well, I was asking about data sharing. And again, I'm from Texas, or North Texas, municipalities are talking to one another about, transferring water between the 2 basins, this and that. But really knowing what's going on with other utilities in the watershed really to me represents that smart one water. But I guess my question is, have you considered putting a framework together when you do get the stakeholders together about sharing that data? And really, from an operational perspective, because when you think about it, cities will share data with one another from traffic and signal traffic lights. And I don't understand why utilities can't do that. I've been in this industry for 30 years, and we just don't like sharing data.
So we do share our data. In the Delaware River Basin, we have what's known as the Delaware River Basin Commission. So the 4 basin states signed a compact in conjunction with the federal government, and the federal government is the Philadelphia District Corps of Engineers. And we have, through this commission, it publicly shares all of our data. We have links to it on the website. We do an annual report publicly where we present it to whoever wants to come and listen to it. We actually have made a public version of our model, which is the operation support tool. We've made the planning support tool, and we've made that publicly available through this website, and we have showed people how to use it so that they can go in and mess with the system and try different configurations and see where the data comes from. We've showed them like the different data sets that we use, like here's the link to AHIPS, here's the link, to the National Weather Service. This is where we're pulling our information from. It's been an extensive educational campaign to try to get people to understand the data and where it comes from, but we have made it publicly available. And I don't know if that helped, because I don't think I could put anything on that website that will get the entire general public to understand what it is that we do and what we're looking at. But it has helped to a certain extent that, just it helps with the transparency of it. Like, we're not trying to hide anything. Here is everything that we use. So have at it.
I'm going to piggyback on that because that's one recommendation that came out of the task force was everybody has data about our watershed, but how do we bring it all together? And that's one recommendation that we're hoping to develop with our local university, Florida International University, Tiffany, shout out, who was also a member of our task force. I think that you're absolutely right. You know, bringing the data together is one thing, but then how do you help folks understand it? And so I love dashboards. Those are my favorite tools right now. And so developing those dashboards based on the data, and the data also historical data, right? From the beginning of when we started collecting water samples to today. And everyone is doing something, whether it's a utility, whether it's universities, whether it's local governments, you know, on projects, whether it's the Corps, everyone's modeling something. So bringing all that together, and then again, the challenge is how do you help the public and our policymakers understand it? Because our elected officials are not all engineers and scientists, guys. You know, that's the hard part.
Right, so you're gonna continue that conversation.
Can I just add something to that?
Sure, go ahead.
So I think it's, you know, it's great, and helping people understand something, helping, you know, explaining a tool, explaining the science, that's great. But I think, you know, in terms of really getting people to understand something, it helps to do co-creation. So in the Chesapeake Bay, for Chesapeake Bay watershed modeling, right, under the EPA, created, you know, the phase 1 model, phase 2 model, all the way to phase 5 model, right? And, you know, scientists like myself always were looking to add processes, add, you know, something more, and the model became more and more complex. And with the phase 6 model, they decided to take an entirely different approach, where they asked the stakeholders, the policymakers, what is it that you really need from the model? And they basically co-created, you know, a decision support tool. It's still based on you know, some of the numerical codes and so forth that were used, but greatly simplifies, you know, and drives to the purpose, you know, that's needed. And as a result, because people engage in the process, the stakeholders engage in the process, they feel ownership for it, they're much more likely to trust the results. So it's not just a communication issue, it's an engagement issue.
Okay, so that's perfect. I think around you want to close.
Yes, I'll just close with my model. My model is basically, what's the problem? What are the solutions? How much does it cost? And who supports it? That's all these folks need to understand to make decisions.
Okay, great. Thank you.